The deed lay on the table like something that had died there. It was a single sheet of yellowed paper, weighted at one corner by a brass inkstand, and the four men in the long room at Wexmoor regarded it the way men regard a thing they have agreed not to touch. Rain moved against the tall windows in slow grey sheets. A fire had been lit grudgingly and gave off more smoke than warmth, until the air carried the smell of wet ash and that particular cold which lives in great houses where no one is loved. The woman stood, the men sat. The arrangement had not been discussed. It had simply happened the way weather happens, and no one thought to correct it. Her name, as far as they knew it, was Mrs. Vane. She was perhaps 32, dressed in mourning grey, gone soft at the cuffs, and she held herself with the kind of stillness that men of rank mistook for meekness because they had never once been required to learn the difference. Her hands were folded before her and did not move. The solicitor, Mr. Pruitt, cleared his throat and read the terms aloud, and as he read, the Duke of Wexmoor watched the rain and not the woman, because the woman was, to him, a piece of business being concluded, and one did not look at business. The estate known as Grey Hollow Grange, Pruitt read, together with its house, its outbuildings, its orchard, and the 41 acres pertaining thereto, is hereby conveyed without further obligation to Mrs. Adeline Vane, widow, for her sole use. He paused. He looked faintly embarrassed. His Grace wishes it understood that the property carries no income, no tenants of worth, and no expectation of any. It carries a roof, said the land agent, though I would not stand under it in a strong wind. His name was Silas Crail, and he had served the dukedom for 30 years, and he smiled when he said it. A thin, practiced smile, learned by a man who knew that cruelty went down easier when it wore the costume of a joke. The Duke said nothing for a moment. Then he turned from the window. Julian, the 7th Duke of Wexmoor, was a man in his middle 30s with a fine cold face and eyes that had stopped expecting anything, and he had given away the worthless Grange for the simplest of reasons. A debt of honour, owed to a man he could not now properly recall, had been called in by a letter, and discharging it with Grey Hollow had cost him nothing he valued. He gave away the Grange the way another man might give away a coat he had grown tired of, and expected to feel, when it was done, the small clean relief of being rid of a thing. You understand, he said to the woman, that you are accepting a ruin. I understand, she said. Most would not. I am not most. She said it without heat, the way one states the weather, and something in the flatness of it made Crail's smile falter for half a second. The Duke did not notice. He gestured to the deed, and Pruitt turned it and offered her the pen. 1 minute passed. 2. She did not snatch at it, nor weep her gratitude as Crail had expected, nor haggle, nor ask what a sensible woman would about wells and tithes and winter. She simply took up the pen, signed her name in a hand steadier than any man's at that table, set it down and looked at last directly at the Duke. And there was, in that look, something he could not name and would spend a year failing to name. It was not gratitude, it was patience. It was the patience of a tide. Thank you, Your Grace, she said, for giving me back what was already mine. He heard the words. He did not hear them. He took them for the strange formal courtesy of the lowborn and thought no more of it, because the rain had let up and he wished to ride before dark. But Crail heard them differently. Crail, who forgot nothing, who had built his life upon the things other men forgot, felt a small cold finger trace his spine. He watched her fold the deed against her heart, where a woman keeps the thing she will not lose, and he thought, though he could not yet have said why, I should not have let that one near us. There was something in her voice that was older than this house. Grey Hollow lay 7 miles to the west. At the cold bottom of a valley, the sun seemed to leave early and reach late. The cart took the better part of a day to bring her there, jolting down lanes gone to mud, past unlaid hedges and fields where the rye had seeded itself wild, and the gates hung open on broken hinges. Adeline did not speak to the carter. She sat with her hands in her lap and watched the land come up to meet her, and the carter, who liked his wages and his quiet, did not see that she was weeping because she wept the way she did everything, without sound and without spilling. She had not seen this valley in 23 years. It had grown smaller, the way the places of one's childhood do, and poorer and wild, but not unrecognizable, and that undid her. There was the bend in the river where the willows leaned, the standing stone the children swore was a witch turned cold for her sins, the long, low rise, and then the chimneys, 4 of them, 3 fallen, one standing crooked against the sky the colour of a drowned thing. Grey Hollow Grange, the house her father had loved. The house her father had been driven from on a winter morning with his hat in his hands and his children behind him and his name being struck, that very hour, from the rolls of every man who had ever called him friend. The cart stopped in the courtyard, and she stepped down into ankle-deep grass, a single grey figure in a vast grey ruin, and let the cart rattle away without her, and she was alone. The house was worse than the letters had warned. Half the east wing had given itself up to weather. The roof there was a cage of black rafters open to the rain, and the floors below had rotted through and grown a pale crop of fungus. The kitchen had been stripped, even the iron fire dogs prized out and sold, and the great hall, where her mother had once stood candle in hand on the eve of every harvest, was a place of bird droppings and broken glass and a tilted table no one had thought worth the carrying. She walked through all of it without flinching. She had prepared herself for years, the way a swimmer prepares for cold water, but when she came to the wide window and looked out over what had been the garden, she found she could no longer prepare for anything, and she pressed her fist against her sternum, against the place where grief sits, and held it there until the worst of the wave had passed. In the center of the old courtyard stood the pear tree. Her grandfather had planted it. Her father had lifted her into it as a child, and she had sat in its branches on summer evenings with the whole Gold Valley below and believed, in the way of the very young, that the world was good and would stay so. The tree was dead now, or it looked dead. Its bark had gone black and split, its branches bare and brittle, reaching up out of the long grass like the fingers of a hand clawing to be free. It should have rotted and fallen long ago. It had not. It stood the way she stood, ruined and refusing, and when she saw it her breath caught, because it was the first thing in all that desolation that did not feel like loss. It felt like a promise the land had made and meant to keep. It was then that she heard the growl. The dog came out from under the fallen east wing, low and slow, a great gaunt grey beast with a torn ear and the wary, friendless eyes of a creature that has been thrown stones by everything that ever drew near it. It was thin to the point of cruelty. It bared its teeth. It did not advance and it did not retreat. It simply held its ground in the wreck it had made its own, and told her, in the only language it had, that this was its place now, that it had nothing left to lose, and that it would defend its nothing to the death. Adeline crouched. She did not reach for it. She simply lowered herself to its level, went still and waited, and the rain fell on them both. 1 minute, 2. The growl wound down, the dog's torn ear twitched, and after a long while, because she had given it the one thing no one else ever had, which was time, it crept forward on its belly, and stopped, and looked at her with an expression almost like apology. "I know," she said. "No one wanted you either." By evening she had made the one dry room habitable, laid a fire with wood she split herself, and shared with the dog the bread and hard cheese she had brought. He ate from a yard away and would come no nearer, but he did not leave, and when she lay down on her folded cloak by the small fire, he lay down too, in the doorway, between her and the dark. And that was the first night in 23 years that Adeline Ashford slept under her father's roof. The hearth was warm, the first warm thing the house had held in longer than the dog had been alive, and out in the black courtyard, the dead pear tree stood guard over what it knew and would not yet tell. The village was called Lowford, and it decided against her before she had been 3 days at the Grange. She did not understand at first how thoroughly a place could close its face. She walked the 2 miles in to buy flour and tallow and seed, with coin good as any man's, and the miller, at a look from a thin clerk come down special from Wexmoor, found the price had risen, and risen again when she did not flinch, until it stood at 3 times what the farmer behind her paid for the same sack. The chandler had no candles to sell her. The smith was too busy to mend her gate, and would be too busy, she understood, for the rest of his life. At the inn the talk stopped when she entered and started again lower when she left, and what it said was that the new woman at Grey Hollow was a mad woman, or a fraud, or a witch like the Standing Stone, that she would not last the winter, and that it would be unwise, here a name was not spoken but understood, to be the man who helped her. She did not argue. She did not weep in the lane where they could see. She simply paid the miller his thievery without a word, because she needed the flour, and carried it the 2 miles home on her own, back through the rain, and did the same the next week and the week after, and Lowford watched her do it and was, by slow degrees, unsettled, because cruelty expects either submission or fury, and she gave it neither. She gave it patience, and patience, to people who have been taught that the strong are loud, is the most frightening thing in the world. 7 miles away, in the agent's narrow house behind the Wexmore stables, Silas Crail sat late over his ledgers and was not satisfied. He had set the machine in motion easily enough. He had only to let it be known that the woman was to be given no purchase, and the village, which lived and died at the dukedom's pleasure, had done the rest. By every measure, she should already be broken. The Grange could not feed her. The winter would finish it. He had ruined harder people for smaller reasons, but he was not satisfied. He turned her words over and over the way a man worries a stone in his pocket, for giving me back what was already mine. It was nothing. It was a phrase. And yet, it had lodged in him like a splinter under the nail, because there was a thing in Crail's past, a single thing, that he had spent 30 years burying deep, and the foundation of everything he now was rested upon its staying buried. He rose and took from a locked cabinet an old map of the Western Valley, and looked long at the 41 acres marked in a clerk's faded hand, with a name that was not Wexmore, and had been made Wexmore by his own young, steady hand a lifetime ago. He had been so careful. He had burned the originals and watched them burn. There was no proof left in the world that Grey Hollow had ever belonged to the family it had belonged to, and the man who could have testified had died of cold and shame the following spring, and his children had scattered and been heard of no more. There was no danger. He told himself there was no danger, and he rolled the map and locked it away and could not sleep. At Grey Hollow, the dog had a name now. She had not chosen it. He had earned it. On her 4th morning, she had found him standing in the cold ashes of the hearth, grey from nose to tail with the dust of it, looking so absurd and so pleased with himself that she had laughed aloud for the first time in longer than she could remember. "Ash," she had said, "you ridiculous creature. Ash." And he had wagged the broken stump of a tail he had clearly not wagged in years, and the name had stuck, and so had he. He followed her now at a fixed distance of 4 feet, and when men came up the lane, for Crail sent them, to count her dwindling stores and report on the progress of her despair, Ash placed himself between her and them and showed every tooth in his head, and the men did not come up the lane twice. She worked. There is no other word for those first weeks. She simply worked, from the grey before dawn to the grey after dusk, and the work was the only prayer she allowed herself. She cleared the kitchen and scoured it and got the great range, rusted to ruin, to draw, and to hold a fire. She did not weep, she dug. She did not despair, she planted. She turned over a corner of the old kitchen garden with a fork she had found in the well and oiled back to use, and set in it the seed she had carried 7 miles on her back, and over it she said no words at all, because some hopes are too important to risk speaking. She did not let them see her break. And the village watched the chimney of Grey Hollow give up its thin thread of smoke each morning, against all their expectations, and did not know what to make of a fire that would not go out. To understand why a woman would carry flour 7 miles on her back, rather than give up a ruin, you must go back 23 years, to a different winter and the same valley, and to a man named Thomas Ashford, Adeline's father, who was, by every account of those who knew him, before the world taught them to forget, a good one. The Ashfords had held Grey Hollow for 5 generations. They were the small, decent gentry the great families neither noticed nor needed, and they had farmed their 41 acres well, and paid their dues, and raised their children to be kind. And Thomas had loved the land the particular way a man loves a thing he means to leave better than he found it. He planted the pear tree's children all along the south wall. He carried his small daughter on his shoulders through the orchard, and named for her every tree, and told her again and again the sentence she would carry through all of her ruined and unruined life. The land knows its own, Addie. Be good to it, and it will keep faith with you long after the people don't. He had not reckoned on Silas Crail. Crail had come to the valley as a young agent of the 6th Duke, Julian's father, a hard-grasping man who measured his worth in acres and set his agent to consolidate the western holdings by any means the law could be made to wear. Grey Hollow sat squarely in the land the dukedom wished to enclose, and Thomas Ashford would not sell because the land was not his to sell, he said. He was only its steward. So Crail, who was young and brilliant and entirely without flaw beneath his feet, did what the law could be dressed to permit. He forged a debt, a loan that had never been made, and a signature copied so faithfully that Thomas Ashford, shown it in the magistrate's chamber, went white and then silent. because he could not prove a negative, because the men who would decide were the Duke's men, and because the truth, in that room, had no friends at all. They took the Grange in a single morning. They struck his name from the parish rolls and the very memory of the place, as the powerful can, so that within a few years it was as though the Ashfords had never been, as though a good man had not died that following spring in a borrowed bed with his face to the wall. Adeline was 9. She remembered the cart. She remembered her father's hands, so steady all her life, shaking as they could not stop, and the last thing he had managed to say to her, bent close so the others would not hear, in the cold hut with the snow coming under the door. I kept the proof, Addie, his voice a thread, his eyes burning. I could not save us with it. There was no one to take it to, and they would only have burned it as they burned the rest. But I hid it. I hid it where the land keeps its own. One day there will be ears that listen, and when there are, you go home, and you ask the tree. His breath had failed him then. Ask the tree, he said again, and that was all. And he was gone, and she had been a child, and had not understood, and the words had sunk down into her like a stone into a well and lain at the bottom of her, dark and waiting, for 23 years. She had grown. A marriage neither cruel nor warm to a quiet draper named Vane had left her widowed with a small clean sum and just enough freedom to begin the patient, grinding work of the dispossessed. She had searched. She had traced the old parish clerk's daughter to a workhouse and bought from her, for her last coin, a single half-burned page. Not the proof itself, but a record that a proof had existed and been silenced. It was enough to begin on. And then had come the strangest turn of all. She had written to the present Duke of Wexmoor, reminding him of a true old debt of honour his father had owed hers and never repaid. And the 7th Duke, who knew nothing and cared less, had discharged it in the cheapest coin he possessed. He had given her the worthless estate no one wanted. He had given her back the very ground in which her father had buried the truth. She stood now in that ground, 23 years on, a free woman with a deed against her heart and a dead tree in her courtyard, and she understood at last what her father had not been able to make a 9-year-old understand. Ask the tree. She did not yet know how, but she knew with a deep, slow certainty that had carried her through the rain again and again, that the proof was here, that it had waited as she had waited, and that she would not leave this valley a second time without it. Winter came down hard, and she did not break, and that, more than any rumour, more than any closed shop, was what began to turn the valley. It began with old Eli Marsh. He was the last living soul who had worked the grey hollow land in the Ashford days, a bent, weathered, monosyllabic man of nearly 80, who lived alone in a hovel at the valley's far end and spoke to almost no one. He had watched the new woman's chimney smoke all through November, the way a sailor watches a far light, and on the first hard morning of December, when she could be seen out in her dead orchard with an axe, taking down the rotted limbs that endangered the rest, he came as far as her broken gate and stood there, working his jaw, until she noticed him and came over wiping her hands. He looked at her a long time, at her face, then her hands, then oddly, the way she stood, weight square and chin level, and something moved behind his old eyes. You hold a billhook like a body that was taught young, he said. It was not a question. I was taught young, she said. By who? She might have lied. She had lied to everyone for months, but there was something in his face she had not seen in any other face in that valley, and it loosed her tongue against all her careful sense. By a man who loved this orchard, she said quietly, more than he loved his own safety, which is why he had neither in the end. The old man's jaw stopped working. He stared at her, and then he said the thing she would remember on her deathbed, the blunt sentence that named her not a stranger come to fail, but a thing returning. He said, I knew your father. I'd have known you anywhere. You've his way of standing in the cold like you've a right to it. He paused. He looked at the dead pear tree, and then back at her, and his old voice cracked clean down the middle. The land knows its own, girl. It's been waiting. So've I. She did not weep. She took his hard old hand in both of hers and held it, and the dog Ash, who trusted no man living, came and pressed his great grey head against the old man's knee, and the three of them stood there in the white morning, and that was the day Grey Hollow stopped being a ruin and became, again, a home its people were coming back to. I will pause here a moment, because some of you have walked this far down the cold lane with Adeline, and may wish to walk the rest of it too, and if her quiet has reached you at all, you might let the channel know with a subscribe. So the next story finds its way to you the way old Eli found his way to that broken gate. And now, back to the valley, where the smoke was rising and the seeds sleeping under the frost, and everything, against everything, had begun to grow. Eli came every day after that. He brought tools he had kept oiled for 50 years against a day he had never named. He showed her where the old drains ran and which fields drank and which fed, and he could not lift much, but he could point and he could remember, and remembering was the thing the valley most needed. Where Eli came, others followed, in twos and threes, a tenant's widow who feared Crail less than she feared starving, 2 young brothers with strong backs and no land of their own, the smith's own apprentice, slipping up the lane after dark to mend the gate the smith would not. By the turn of the year there were 6 of them, and then 9, and the chimneys of Grey Hollow that had not all drawn together in a generation drew together now, and the valley below looked up at the smoke and did not know whether to be glad or afraid, and was a little of both. The Duke came in the spring. He had not meant to. He had meant only to ride the western boundary, which he did perhaps once a year and with no pleasure, but Crail, growing daily more grey and silent, had pressed it on him with an urgency the Duke found tiresome and did not examine. There were irregularities at Grey Hollow, Crail said. The woman was gathering people. She was, Crail said, the word coming out of him thin and dry, organizing. The Duke did not care about a widow and her chickens, but the morning was fine and the agent would not leave off, and so he rode the 7 miles west, expecting to find a hovel and a harridan and to be home by noon. He drew rein at the top of the long rise, and he did not for a moment know where he was. He remembered Grey Hollow, or remembered the idea of it, the entry in a ledger, the word ruin. What lay below him in the green spring light was not a ruin. The fields had been ploughed and were greening. The hedges were laid. The gates hung true. The house had lost its cage of black rafters, the east wing newly roofed, the fresh thatch pale gold against the old grey stone. Smoke rose, 3 columns of it, straight into the still morning. There were sheep on the standing stone meadow, a girl driving geese, a great grey dog asleep in the sun. And there was a woman crossing the yard with a yoke of pails across her shoulders, moving with the unhurried economy of someone who has done the same thing 10,000 times. And as the Duke watched her, something turned over in his chest that had not turned in years, slow and painful, like a key in a lock long rusted shut. He rode down. She set down the pails when she saw him and stood waiting, neither hurrying to greet him nor pretending not to see, and the dog rose and came to her side and watched him with flat yellow eyes. "Mrs. Vane," he said, "Your Grace." He looked about him, helpless to stop. The new roof, the turned earth, the lambs, the impossible ordinary breathing life of the place, and heard himself say in a voice gone strange to his own ears, "What have you done here?" "Only what wanted doing," she said. "I gave you a ruin." "You gave me a beginning," she said, "and called it a ruin because you had never seen what it could be. Most men can't. They see the broken thing and think the brokenness is the truth of it." She looked at him with that same patience he had carried away from the cold room a season before and never put down. "But the brokenness is only what was done to it. It isn't what it is." He did not answer. He had no answer. He was a man who had been given everything and let it all go grey around him. His great cold houses, his cold marriage that the influenza had ended 2 years before, leaving not grief, which would at least have been something, but a vast and level nothing. And now he watched a woman in patched grey turn the estate he had thrown away into the only living thing he had seen in a decade, and he felt the first thin crack run through the nothing, and it frightened him, and he could not look away. His eye fell on the pear tree, still black, still bare among all that greening, the one dead thing in the yard. That should come down, he said, because he needed to say something. "No," she said, "quick, too quick." And then, recovering, level again. "No, it will come back. Some things only look dead, Your Grace. They are only waiting for the right spring." He stayed an hour. He had meant to stay 10 minutes. When he rode away at last, he was silent the whole 7 miles home, and Crail, meeting him in the stable yard, saw the Duke's face and let his report die, because it was the face of a man who had seen something, and Crail had spent his whole life dreading exactly that, the day a Wexmoor began, at last, to see. He had until autumn to act, and he knew it now, the way a drowning man knows the depth of the water. The woman was not failing, the woman was thriving, and the valley was turning to her, and the The Duke was the danger Crail had never once in 30 years had to fear, the danger of his own master developing eyes. If the woman found a thread, and the Duke were ever in a humor to pull it, the whole buried thing might come up out of the ground, and Silas Crail would go down into a darkness from which no agent's cleverness could lift him. He could not allow it. He had not committed his one great crime in order to be undone, in his old age, by a widow with a fork and a dog. So he stopped being clever, which was his great mistake, and in fear he reached, as frightened powerful men always do, for force. The blow fell at midsummer. 2 of her young men had built a dam under Eli's pointing finger to bring the dead bottom meadow back into grass. A month of work, standing between the river and 40 newly seeded acres. At some black hour past midnight, a man Crail paid came down through the willows with an iron bar and broke it. The water came through in a wall. It would have drowned the whole lower farm. The new grass, the sleeping lambs, very likely the men in the byre, but the dog woke. Ash threw up his head in the dark courtyard and gave a howl no one had ever heard from him, long and broken and terrible, and it brought Adeline out in her shift with a lantern, and she saw the white water coming and screamed the men awake. They saved what could be saved, the lives, the lambs, 3 of the 40 acres, working chest deep until dawn, and when light came up, it showed them the broken dam and the clean cut of the iron bar in it that no flood ever made, and they understood, wet and ruined in the cold morning, exactly what had been done and by whom. It was the closest she came, in all that long year, to breaking. She stood at the edge of the drowned field with her hands hanging empty at her sides, and Eli beside her wept the slow, furious tears of the very old, and the young men looked at her to know whether to despair, and for one moment, Adeline Ashford felt the whole weight of 23 years come down at once and very nearly buckled under it. And then the gig came up the lane. It was driven hard and badly by a woman in a black travelling cloak, who hauled the horse to a stop in the flooded yard, stepped down into the muck in good boots, took one sweeping look at the wreckage and the wet, exhausted people, and said, in a voice like a file drawn across iron, "Well, they've finally grown careless. I had begun to think they never would." She was perhaps 60, sharp-faced, magnificently unimpressed by ruin. Adeline Ashford, you have your mother's bones and your father's idiot stubbornness, and thank God for both. I am Hester Quillen. I taught you your letters in this very house before these thieves put us into the road, and I have spent 30 years learning the law for the day you would write to me, which you finally did. She looked at the broken dam with a terrible glittering joy. A man who breaks a dam in the night is afraid, and a frightened man makes the one mistake the careful ones never do. He acts. We are going to hang Silas Crail with his own rope, inside the law, and we begin with the one thing he could never find or destroy. Your father swore it still exists. The proof. Where is it? And Adeline, standing in the wreck of half her hopes with the other half blazing suddenly back to life, turned and looked across the drowned and shining yard at the one thing the flood had not touched, the one thing that stood as it had always stood, black and bare and waiting in the risen sun. He told me to ask the tree, she said. They went to the tree. It had stood so long, dead and undying, at the center of everything, that she had searched the whole rest of the estate before she let herself believe her father could have meant it so plainly. She had pried up floors and sounded walls and emptied the dry well. She had taken Ask the Tree for a riddle, the way the clever always take the simple for a riddle. But Hester Quillen searched with a lawyer's plain cold sense, not a child's grief, and she walked once around the black trunk in the wet grass and stopped where the great roots heaved up on the south side, and she said, "Your father planted this tree's children all along that wall. A man who plants does not hide a thing in stone or water. He hides it in the ground, in the one root no one will ever dig up, because to dig it up is to kill the tree, and he trusts the tree to keep faith because it is the only thing left in the world that he can trust. Bring the spades, carefully. We are not going to harm it." They dug. They dug slow and gentle as surgeons all through that long afternoon, easing the earth from the great south root, and the whole household stood around in a silent ring, and the light went gold and slanting. And just as Adeline began, again, to despair, one of the young men's spades met something that was not stone and not root. It was a box, a flat box of sheet lead, soldered shut against the wet, no bigger than a Bible, wrapped in a strip of oiled leather gone black as the tree, and cradled in the curve of the root as though it had grown around it on purpose to hold it safe, which, across 23 years, perhaps it had. Adeline lifted it out with her 2 hands. It weighed nothing. It weighed everything. She knelt in the gold light with her father's last secret in her lap and could not make herself open it, because while it was shut it might be anything, the whole of her hope or the death of it, and she had carried the hope so long she feared the moment it must become true or become nothing. "Open it, girl," said Eli, very softly. "He hid it for you to open." She broke the soldered seam with a knife. Inside, dry as the day they were sealed away, lay 3 things. The first was the true deed to Grey Hollow Grange, the one Crail believed he had watched burn, granted to the Ashfords 5 generations back. The second was a letter in her father's hand, dated the week of his ruin, setting down the whole of what had been done, the forged debt, the false signature, the magistrate who would not hear him, and naming the agent Silas Crail who built the lie and the 6th Duke who let it stand. And the third turned one ruined man's word against the powerful into a rope that would hold a weight. It was the forger's own first draft. Crail, young and arrogant, had practiced the false signature again and again on a single sheet before committing it to the deed, growing surer line by line toward the perfect copied name. Crail's hand, Crail's crime, learning to be a thief. Hester Quillen looked at it for a long, long time. Then she let out a slow breath, and for once in her acid life she had nothing sharp to say. "Oh, Thomas," she said softly to the gold heir, "you clever, faithful man, you kept it after all." She folded the papers with hands not entirely steady and looked up at Adeline. "We have him. Do you understand me? The deed gives you the land, the letter gives you the wrong. But this," she touched the practice sheet, "this gives us the man, in a court, before a judge who answers to no duke. We have him." Adeline did not cheer. She did not weep. She put her hand against the black bark of the tree that had kept faith for 23 years, palm flat, the way you touch a living thing, and stayed like that a long while as the sun went down. And whether it was the trick of the failing gold light, or whether the season had simply come at last, those nearest her swore afterward that they saw, on the lowest twig of the long dead tree, the first hard green knot of a bud. They did it inside the law, as Hester had promised, and they did it where Crail could not reach the levers, taking the whole of it not to the local magistrate, who was the dukedom's creature, but to the assize court in the county town, where Hester Quillen had spent 30 years making herself known to people who could not be bought, and they did it, by Adeline's own insistence and against Hester's advice, in the presence of the Duke, for she had thought long about the Duke. She had every right to ruin him with it. His house had built its western holdings on the bones of hers, and the law might well have stripped the 7th Duke of more than the Grange. But she had watched his face turn over in her courtyard in the spring, had seen the light come into the nothing, and she had made a choice that Hester called soft, and that Eli called just, and that she herself called only the truth, that the son who knew nothing was not the father who had known all, and that a man given the chance to choose rightly should be given the chance before he was condemned for choosing wrong. So she wrote to him. She wrote him a single line: "Come to the assize on the day of Crail's hearing, and learn what your house is built on, and decide, in front of God and the county, what kind of man you mean to be." He came. Of course he came. He had not been able to stop thinking of her since the spring, and the line of her letter struck the cracked nothing in him like a hammer. He sat at the back of the court, alone, in plain dark clothes, and watched. He watched Hester Quillen lay it out, piece by patient piece, the deed, the letter, the practice sheet. The expert who swore the practice hand and the forged deed were one. He watched old Eli Marsh climb shaking into the box and tell, in his cracked monosyllables, of the morning 23 years before when Thomas Ashford was put into the road, and he watched Silas Crail, who had ruled the valley by fear for 30 years, sit grey and shrinking as the rope drew tight, his composure coming apart line by line, until at the last, when his own younger hand was held up before the court, learning to be a forger, the mask did not so much slip as fall all at once to the floor. Crail came to his feet. He could not help it. 30 years of buried fear came out of him in a single ragged shout. That land was worthless. It was nothing. He would only have let it rot. And stopped, hearing the confession in it. The whole court heard it too, and went silent, and Silas Crail stood there with his ruin on his face, and understood that the burying was over. It was then that the Duke rose. The room turned. He walked down the aisle in the dead quiet, and he did not look at Crail. He looked at Adeline, and he said, in a clear voice that carried to every corner, the thing that decided what kind of man he meant to be. "My house did this," said Julian, Duke of Wexmoor. "My father knew, and was silent, and profited, and I have spent my life enjoying the profit and asking no questions. I will not be silent." He turned to the judge. "Whatever this court requires of me to make it right, it shall have. The land is hers. It was always hers. I gave her back what was already her own and did not even know I did it." He looked again at Adeline, and his cold, fine face was not cold at all now. It was open and stricken and alive. She told me, in her courtyard, that the brokenness of a thing is not the truth of it, only what was done to it. His voice caught and held. "I have been a broken thing a long time. I should like, if she will allow it, to find out what I am." Crail was taken away. The land was restored. The deed entered. The wrong set down at last where the powerful could no longer reach to strike it out. But Adeline scarcely heard the end of it. She was looking at the Duke, and he at her, across the crowded court, and in his face she saw the same hard green knot she had seen on the dead tree, the bud that means the long winter is at last, giving way. A year passed. It passed the way good years do, without spectacle, and at the end of it, on a gold evening in the late summer, Julian, Duke of Wexmoor, rode the 7 miles west to Grey Hollow Grange, and at the top of the long rise he drew rein, as he had 2 summers before, and looked down into the valley, and could not recognize it. He could not recognize it. The words rose in him with a kind of wonder, because they were the same words he had thought the first time, and truer now than they had been then, because the beginning had become a whole and living world. The fields below ran gold with standing corn down to the river. The mended house stood square and warm in the last of the light, every chimney drawing, and a long low new barn beside it, and beyond that the cottages of the dozen families who farmed the land and were free upon it. The bottom meadow that the flood had drowned was deep green again, and full of cattle, and there were children, running along the hedges with the great grey dog, old now, grey on grey, lumbering joyfully after them. He heard, faint across the gold air, the sound of someone laughing, and the ring of the smith's hammer, the same smith who had once been too busy to mend her gate, and never spoke now of the year he had been afraid. Everything below him grew. Everything below him was no longer alone, and in the courtyard, where one dead black thing had stood guard over the truth for 23 years, the pear tree was in fruit. It had come back, exactly as she had sworn it would. It had broken into leaf that first spring, slow and disbelieving, as though it had forgotten how, and blossomed the next, a whole white cloud of it, and now in the late summer it hung heavy with the first pears it had borne in a generation, gold and ripening in the warm light, and beneath it, on a bench her young men had made, sat Adeline. She was not in grey any longer. She had laid the morning down at last, and she looked up the long rise and saw him there against the sky, and she rose, and she waited, in that way she had, without hurrying, certain of the tide. He came down. He had come down 100 times that year, on every honest errand he could invent and several he could not, to make right what his house had done, he told himself, and to be near the only living thing he had found in a decade of grey, which was the truer reason, and which she had known long before he had. He left his horse at the gate and crossed the courtyard, and the old dog lifted his grizzled head, thumped his broken tail, and did not trouble to rise, having long since decided this man was allowed. The Duke stopped before the bench under the laden tree, and for a moment neither spoke, and the gold light lay over everything, the corn, the cottages, the fruit, the 2 of them, warm where the world had been so cold. "I could not recognize it," he said at last. "From the top of the rise, I have ridden down it 100 times, and still, this evening, I looked and I did not know it." He shook his head slowly. "It is not the ruin I gave you. It is not even the beginning you showed me. It is—" He stopped, searching, a man unused to the word. "It is living." She looked at him, and she gave him back the word, plain and quiet, the way her father had given her his one true sentence in the cold a lifetime ago, the way a thing is handed down. "Living," she said. Old Eli Marsh, who was sitting in the warm by the door because he was 81 now and did less and watched more, and who missed nothing, called across the gold yard in his cracked old voice, half to them and half, perhaps, to the faithful tree and the patient land itself. "Aye," he said, It always was, underneath. It was only waiting. He looked at the two of them standing close beneath the heavy fruit, at the Duke who had learned to see, and the daughter who had come home, and his old face cracked into the rare and total smile of a man who has lived long enough to watch the wheel come all the way round. Everything grows, said Eli, when it is no longer alone. And the warm wind moved through the orchard, and a single ripe pear came loose and fell and rolled in the gold grass to rest against her foot, the first fruit where the land keeps its own. She bent and picked it up. She held it a moment in her open hand, and then she gave it, still warm from the sun, to the man who had given her a ruin and never known he was giving her the world. And he took it, and their hands touched and stayed, and far off the children laughed, and the smoke rose straight and steady from every mended chimney into the gold and forgiving evening, and the long winter, at the very last, was over.